So welcome today to our Managing a Neurodiverse Workforce virtual boardroom that is being facilitated by HR Recruit and Helen Bailey from Strategi Solutions. My name's Jo Thompson and I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by Helen, who will introduce herself shortly. Helen is going to share her experience about neurodiversity in the workplace and look at how to build an inclusive neurodiverse workplace. If you do have any burning questions during this session, then please put them into the chat box facility and we will cover them as we go along. I'm now going to hand you over to Helen, who will introduce herself and start the session. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So I'm just going to share my slides and then we will get into the session. So as Jo said, and thank you, Jo, for having me again. I'm going to talk about what it means to have a neurodiverse workforce. So what is neurodiversity and really what should we be kind of putting in place to do that? Before I kind of get into the meat of the session, I guess, just a little bit about us. That's me. If you'd like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm always open to that. That is my action shot, which we particularly like of me doing that. But as you'll see, I'll probably do less of that and more talking during this whole experience. And I am the head of learning development for a company called Strategi Solutions. And if you've never heard of Strategi, we are a business consultancy essentially, and we focus on three main things. We focus on marketing, so we do like digital, traditional, awards, events, PR. We do creative, so my stripes behind me are all done by our fantastic team upstairs. So design, brand, website design and development. And people stuff, we do HR, culture change, recruitment, health and safety, and of course, amazing L&D. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? And some of our clients, just to give you a flavour of those, just to kind of introduce us as a company. But let's get into the meat of it. This managing a neurodiverse workforce. What does that really mean in practice? So some of the things I want to talk about in this session is to get into some definitions. There's a lot of language. What does that really mean? I also want to talk about some of the facts and figures, and to think about some of the thinking styles and think about, okay, what are the strengths of each of these? And then really think about what are the practical things that you can put in place and really build that inclusive workforce. So let's start off with a little bit of a Menti. So what I'm going to ask you to do is you can either scan the QR code or I'm just going to pop it in the chat for you now. Menti.com and just put the code in there for you. See, I can't talk and type at the same time. It's one of my many failings. There we go. If you go into that, and I'd really like to know what words would you use to describe neurodiversity? So it just takes a minute normally. There we go. So what words would you use to describe neurodiversity? And I think you've got the option to put a couple of ones in there. So I'll just give you a minute while you have a think about what those words might be. There we are. There you go. Creative, unique, special, colourful. Yeah, thank you, Claire, in the chat. Unique as well. I think unique's kind of getting a lot of press there. Normal, varied, adaptive, complex as well, Claire. Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things we quite often get with neurodiversity is that one or two of the thinking styles will kind of stick together outside the box. Amazing. Yeah, it's often described as a superpower, neurodiversity, a different way of thinking, some abstract thinking. Any more for any more? What's the one I've missed? Inclusive, focused. See, just when I think it's finished, it keeps going. And yes, Claire, very individual. Sensitive. And one of the things we're going to talk about actually is that sensory sensitivity. And that's not two words you can say together very easily. But be mindful of that. Okay, so we've kind of got a starting point here. So let's kind of get into what is essentially some of the definitions around this topic. So if we kind of start with neurodiversity itself, that refers to the collective variations in the brain and the cognition, so the way we think, where we deal with sociability, learning, attention, and other mental functions. And then we kind of talk about neurodivergent. Okay. So, using the correct words, I think is really important. So, really thinking about when we're talking about an individual, we talk about them being neurodivergent. And that really means that their mind just thinks differently or works differently from dominant societal norms. And then we kind of get into that neurotypical, which is the complete opposite of neurodiversity. But if you want to expand on that, a neurotypical brain is one that does not display the characteristics of development differences or those atypical patterns. But I kind of want to argue with myself a little bit here because I called this session Managing a Neurodiverse Workforce. And I don't know whether now I might have called it Managing a Neuro-Inclusive Workforce, because I think this is really talks about what it means to be fully inclusive. And that's one of the words that you kind of picked to put in the Menti earlier on. So when we talk about neuro inclusion, that is really about a workplace that is adaptable, flexible, and supportive to enable all employees to do their best work. I wouldn't disagree with you, chap, that suggests neurological differences are normal. What I would say is, we talk about this managing a neurodiverse workforce as though it was something special and something that was specific to a particular organization. But the chances are that everybody is managing a neurodiverse workforce. Something like 1 in 7 in the population is neurodiverse. So let's have a start really about some of these things. So I'm going to show you some questions, and what I'd like you to do is just to pop some figures in the chat as to what you think the answers are. So the first question is, what percentage of individuals say their organisation has an open and supportive climate where employees are able to talk about neurodiversity? Okay. What number would you kind of pop on that? If you can pop me some in the chat. Okay, we got us started quite early on. 12%, 10%, 20, 60, 30, 40, 10. It's a bit up and down. Don't think anybody's got the actual number yet. Not far off though, Vanita. The answer is 53%. So 53% of individuals say their organisation has an open and supportive climate to talk about neurodiversity. And just to kind of build on this, one of the things I would kind of certainly guide you to go and have a look at is just in the last week or so, the CIPD have produced some new research on neurodiversity. And one of the things it talks about is, have you told your manager or HR about your neurodivergence? So if you just have a look at the stats there, 27% told their manager, but 31% had neither told HR or their line manager. And just before I show you that actual figure, why do you think that is? Why do you think 31% had neither told HR or the line manager? Again, that's a pop it in the chat kind of response. So why do you think that might be? Frightened, Jackie? Yeah, don't want to be defined by it, draw attention. I'm not sure what response, stigma. Yeah, there is, not being asked. I think not being asked is a really good shout, actually. There's a lack of trust. I don't feel safe that I'm able to do that. And not knowing how to start the conversation. And one of the slides I'm going to show you later is kind of that whole process of thinking about, okay, if somebody comes to you and tells you they're neurodiverse, how do I have to, how do we have those conversations? Okay, so there's a lot in the chat. There's a lot of sort of fear, negativity. These are the top responses in the CIPD. It's a private matter I don't want to share. I think stigma you mentioned. I don't feel a need to tell my manager or HR. I don't think my manager or my organisation will be able to offer support. So just to give that sort of context in this area. Okay, let's move on to another question. What percentage of neurodiverse people are unemployed in the UK? So again, that's one of those. What's your gut feel on the number, and then drop it into the chat for me. see. I'm going to call that one quite early because I think Claire Elderson got to it the earliest. If I had prizes, I'd give them out, but I don't. So you're just going to have to take virtual prizes at this point. So it's between 30 to 40%, and I think a few people are kind of in that area. Um, and then, as I've said, neurodivergent people are estimated to make up 1 in 7 of the population in the UK. Okay. What percentage of organisations, what percentage of employers have not accommodated their recruitment processes for people with neurodivergent traits? Do you think? Gone quite big and high with this one? Well, I think Emily's probably the closest. 53%. So that's from some City and Guilds research, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Okay, question 4 is about what percentage of autistic adults in the UK are in full-time employment? Quite high. I think Vanita might have been the closest there. So it's actually 16%. Um, and there's a bit of a sort of paradox here that 16% are in full-time employment, but the research shows that a significant majority want to work. And there's been a particular story this week in the news, which kind of talks about somebody who was autistic going for a job. And he says when he got there, they weren't able to make accommodations to enable him to be his best at work. Yeah. Yeah, it probably is, Emily. Yeah, is that who we know has autism? Because I think you can only work with people who've kind of disclosed that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And a good shout to kind of point that out. Okay, what percentage of neurodivergent workers found that they are more likely to apply for a job or continue to work for a company which they knew was supporting neurodivergent employees? Well, what do you think? Yeah, these are high numbers, I think. The answer is 93%. I think if you feel that that's an environment, and I think one of the things we certainly talk to organisations about when we're working with them is about if you want to attract neurodivergent workers, then you have to make it clear that that is something you embrace. And one of the things you could do in terms of the hiring process is really get people to think about, making accommodations available and making it just part of the process rather than there's a form and I have to ask specially. It just becomes something that is available and open to all. Okay, question 6 then. What percentage of respondents said they felt excluded at all kinds of events due to a lack of accessibility that is not welcoming to a neurodivergent employee? Michelle was first in the chat and she was bang on the money. Well done, Michelle. 60%. Yeah, so 60%. What can you do you think, to make events accessible for neurodivergent employees? Again, it's a question for the chat. What do you think you could do? Yeah, you can just ask. Um, yeah, it's kind of a I don't know. We do a lot of diversity work and we always talk about curious and respectful questioning. And I think it's okay to ask and offer a variety of options. Um, you know, yeah, make it part of the culture. Really good. I really like the wording of that, Hannah. Make it part of the culture to ask for preferences for all. Yeah. And there is this, we're going to talk about managing a neurodiverse workforce. And one of the things I'm going to say to you is actually, if you do a lot of this stuff, it'll make it better for everyone. So, that is a really good shout in kind of moving forward with this space. And not to do any sort of more quiz questions, but just a few bits and pieces that I think were worth kind of highlighting. Um, just helping sharpening up brains, having more profitability. Innovation is most likely to come from those parts that we don't all share. Yeah. And there is a really good moral case for inclusion. There is also a really good business case as well. And I think certainly when we're talking to organizations and chief executives and anybody in that kind of C-suite population, then these are the kind of stats that we need to be talking about. And I've mentioned the CIPD report quite a bit. But something else I just kind of want to bring to everyone's attention really is the Matthew Syed book and the Rebel Ideas book. And the book was written to kind of talk about that thinking differently and bringing something else to the party. And this particular quote that I've got on the slide here belongs to a part of the book where he's talking about um, a group of people were brought together to make the England men's football team better. I'm not going to have a discussion here and now about whether that works or not, because I think that is a whole other thing. But it was made of not just football people, but people from all kinds of backgrounds. And one of the things that Matthew Syed talks about is the most exhilarating moments occurred when someone in the room said something unknown to someone else, when they offered an insight drawn from experience that were in some way unique. And they are, in fact, rebel ideas. Um, and one of the things I really want to talk about in this session is, harnessing, those skills and focusing on the strengths that neurodiverse people bring to an organization. Okay, so the next slide, I want to show you some pictures essentially of some people. And just start that off, and then they will start to kind of drop in. And and my question here really is what do you notice about these people? Yeah, all super successful neurodivergents. Yeah, they're all different as well. Yeah. Anybody recognize the one with the guy with the swan on his head? Oh, beauty. I love that Dahlia. Dahlia, sorry. Beautiful, different, and celebrated. Yes, I love that. That picture with the guy with the swan on his head, whether you're familiar with it, is from Grayson's Art Club, which was particularly prominent in lockdown. And it's a picture that's I had to write this down so I didn't forget it. By somebody called Johnny Fisher, and he has ADHD, and that's how it feels to him. So he kind of talks about, on the surface, it's all very serene, but kind of internally, there's a lot going on there. And just to kind of run through, and just in case anyone's unaware, so Andy Warhol, autistic, Richard Branson, dyslexia, Greta Thunberg, autism, and Watson, ADHD, Billie Eilish, Tourette's, Anthony Hopkins, autism, Simone Biles, ADHD, and Steve Jobs, dyslexia. And obviously, they are much more than that. That was just full clarity in that area. Now, you may have seen this a long time ago. So I'm just going to talk about it because I don't manage to watch TV like a normal person. And what I mean by that is I tend to watch it about 6 months later after everybody else has watched it. So if you've seen it 6 months ago, that's fine. A couple of days ago, I sat down to watch World's Most Dangerous Roads. It's on Dave. I'd strongly recommend it if you fancy it. And there were two comedians in the car, and it was Rod Gilbert and Angela Barnes, and both of them um, have just been recently diagnosed with ADHD. And it was just a really interesting chat about how that's kind of impacted on them. So Rod Gilbert was kind of talking about that quite often he'll go away on holiday, they'll be on the ferry to where they're going, and his wife will go, "Have you booked somewhere?" And he's gone, "Oh no, I haven't booked anywhere for us to stay. We're just on the ferry and we're going." And Angela Barnes has talked about, actually it makes her hyper focused. So that kind of difference in that experience. So I'm actually going to see Rod Gilbert in May, and one of the things he talks about it. Thank you, Rhiannon. Yes, it was a really good insight. Thank you for saying you saw it and I didn't just make it up. Yeah, but I'm going to see Rod Gilbert in May, and one of the things he said is he's quite often late for his tour. So I feel like I've got plenty of time to go for a nice meal and have a drink before it actually starts. Um, Okay, let's just talk about some of those sort of common thinking styles. And I really want to say when we talk about this is not a tick list activity. This is not like going, okay, so somebody's autistic. These are all these things. They may be some of them. Yeah, and there may be some differences in that. That's really important. Okay, so if we talk about autism, so some characteristics with autism, that rigid thinking, restrictive and repetitive behaviors, some social communication challenges, some sensory sensitivity. What do you think are some of the strengths for somebody who is autistic? Feel free to pop that in the chat for me. Yep, creative, focused, honest, attentive, great at following rules and processes. Data analysis. Data analysis is a big one, John. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, getting into that details. Let's have a look then at some of these things. So, the problem solving, the analytical thinking, the logical thinking, that data driven. So, John, you were absolutely on the money with that. Some of the potential challenges, and again, we're using the word potential to kind of talk about. It could be, it may not all be these things. So, may find examples of social interaction challenging. Some individuals are non-verbal, so they might need assistive tech, and that finding it hard to read people in that social environment. Okay, let's kind of do the same again, but this time with dyslexia. So that development of literacy and language related skills, the working memory, the speed. Okay, what might be some of the strengths for somebody who's dyslexic? Alternative thinking. Thanks, Emily, for getting us off to a start there. Yeah, back to the creative, and generally there does tend to be a lot of associations with creativity here. So yeah, general inventiveness, creativity, the pattern spotting, when working with data sets. Yeah, there can be a requirement for structure as well. And allowing more time actually, Tracy, as well for that working memory. So I always talk about that 6 seconds. You might want to, say if it's an instruction to do a task, for example, you might want to kind of talk, but then give 6 seconds. So it just allows that working memory to catch up. 6 seconds is a good amount of time because it feels comfortable and it doesn't feel too strange if you don't say anything for 6 seconds as well. So, as we're talking about that weaker working memory, the reading and writing at speed, and the sensory sensitivity, which is the first time we've kind of got into this. But, the bright overhead lights, if you work in an office where there's a lot of music, that can be challenging. Dyspraxia, which is often associated then with being clumsy. So actually, people will often say, I'm dyspraxic, and perhaps what they mean is they're clumsy. And there is a trend actually of people self-diagnosing themselves via TikTok as well. So perception and hearing and an awareness of generally of where they are in the space. Okay. So any thoughts on what some of the strengths would be? This one I think is perhaps a little harder to kind of work out. So I'll kind of move into it. So, that bold, big picture thinking, pattern spotting, that resourceful problem solving. We've talked about clumsiness. Yes, thank you, Claire. We've talked about clumsiness and, somebody who's dyspraxic, they might use a mouse that kind of tips on its side instead. They may find the time management and personal organization challenging. And again, that sensory sensitivity. Let's move into ADHD. So this is that pattern of, hyperactivity, can't say that, impulsivity. There we go. And the brain's often utilized. So we talk about this one, the being at ease with uncertainty, and I think that's to do with the kind of moving about from one thing to the other, insightfulness and potential challenges. Yeah, innovative, enthusiastic. Yeah, uh, very sociable, Emily. Potentially challenges, feeling restless, distracted, easily bored, and it could be that further challenges. Yeah, and I think referring back to that World's Most Dangerous Roads, because Dave are going to give me some royalties at some point, I hope. But Roger Gilbert talked about, he's going along and they go, oh, squirrel, and it kind of just kind of goes off into that, a different strain of attention. And then, just some of the other things that are around. So dyscalculia, which is the difficulty with arithmetic calculations. And just making the point, and as I said earlier, that sometimes these conditions sit together. So dyscalculia is often experienced alongside dyslexia or dyspraxia. Dysgraphia, which is the aspects of writing, and then tics. and Tourette's syndrome, which we mentioned Billie Eilish. And in this new report that's just come out from the CIPD, one of the things they talk about is which of the following do you hold in terms of neurodivergent identities? And you can see that autistic has the highest kind of percentage. Some people have talked about another identity not listed above, and then some people have gone none. And I think there is a trend. It can be quite difficult to get a diagnosis, and there's certainly a trend of older people being diagnosed. Certainly, I think Paddy McGuinness's wife is another example. The two comedians I've already mentioned, they were diagnosed much later in life as well. So let's kind of have a look at some strategies that kind of really work in the workplace. And I'm going to start with recruitment. So just before I kind of show you the research, what do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of recruitment for somebody who's neurodivergent?
Helen, just while we're pausing there, it's
Yeah,
flashed up again that the meeting's going to finish in about just over 3 minutes.
yeah.
I can only apologise to everybody because this happened on Tuesday and I don't know why, because we're on a paid account. So when the meeting finishes, if everyone can just use the same link and sign straight back in, we'll just carry on where we left off. So I'm really sorry about that.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Okay. Yeah, please come back. Yeah. So we're talking about form filling, I think application forms, yeah, match your person with the job, being able to gauge if it isn't mentioned, yeah, answering questions on the spot, actually getting them to apply in the first place, Joe, is a really good question. Yeah, sometimes, think about, and we'll talk about some strategies in a second. So I'm not gonna go into that. I nearly decided to. So some of the greatest challenges are things like interviews, face-to-face job applications, just creating a CV. Those CVs where you have to kind of fill in all the boxes, they can be quite challenging because they've usually got a timed element on them. Just general job searching, and just sharing with the organization. So just some things I think to think about in terms of recruitment, you know, really think about, rather than the CV and interview, how can candidates demonstrate their talents in other ways? So they could do a work task, or they could do some sort of role play, or just, a more practical way of doing that. Yeah. And a job descriptions, vague things has just made me laugh. Sorry, because sometimes they are, yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes they're not done as well as they could do. Um, Make sure that its advertising doesn't automatically screen out people with a gap in their CV. And is it accessible, to someone using a screen reader, for example, and the companies who can help you with that. Sharing case studies about diverse people on your careers page, and it could be a little video, but somebody kind of sharing their story will help you attract neurodivergent candidates. Sending the interview questions or themes in advance, and making sure, and actually, there's a lot of talk about this at the moment, benefiting everybody, not just people who are neurodiverse. So make sure you provide clear information about what will happen, who will be involved, and what's being assessed. And can you provide a quiet place for candidates, before they kind of go into that interview experience. Um, and just thinking about, the briefing for panels, and if we talk about inclusive hiring, which I was talking about yesterday, there should be some flex in terms of, being able to repeat questions, or not penalizing people for kind of appearing nervous or for being honest about not understanding a question. So think about how you would rephrase that question, and how you would reframe it to kind of give it a different feel. So think about having your information in lots of different formats, so it makes it really easy. Make sure you give it in advance so it gives an opportunity to kind of think about that. Think about the obvious aspects of an organizational culture. So what the hours that people work, the patterns, when do they go for a break, typical communication challenges, and have a think about doing what is essentially, a bit of a conversation or some kind of questionnaire at the beginning, which kind of gets people to think about what are their work preferences, and if you do this, it's not a kind of one and done activity. So don't do it once and then think I've never got to do it again. But kind of do it periodically, because things change. That is the nature of life, essentially. So And again, that's something that can be really useful for everybody. I've been talking recently at a careers event, and one of the things I was speaking about was actually, really work out what you want from your manager and kind of ask for it. You won't always get it. I'll be absolutely clear on that, but you can certainly, kind of think about what is really going to work. Um, so the next slide is all about greatest challenges generally in work. So again, if I can ask you to just go to the chat, what do you think might be appearing here in some greatest challenges in work generally? So we've just talked about recruitment and onboarding. Let's kind of think, what about when you actually get to work and you start on your first day? Yep, understanding. Thanks for starting us off, Michelle. Prioritization. Yeah, and able to communicate any issues. Yeah. Thinking, feeling overwhelmed. I think that plays a little bit. I think Laura to the sensory sensitivity. If I say it enough times, I'll be able to say it. Feeling lost, the workloads, the left out of social groups, yeah, the unclear comms and goals, yeah, flexible hours, starts. Okay, let's have a look at I've kind of mentioned two things I would definitely direct you to. This is the Neurodiversity Index report is another one. You see the work-life balance has kind of come up. Yeah, Joe, the noise as well. Time management. I think that was kind of referred to in the chat. Being valued for the skills, emotional well-being, that feeling of being different, that feeling psychologically safe. And I guess that speaks to, do I feel able to talk about this with people and the other conversations being happening? Right the way doing, the bottom one is flexible working options, which I think for me kind of feeds into that work-life balance. And yes, Joe in the chat, adjusting to the new environment. Yeah, is a good shout. So let's talk about some things that can help in work generally. So in terms of meeting strategies, you can think about regular breaks in long meetings and training sessions. Think about, 1 hour meetings. Yeah, I think we've all sat in organizations where we kind of log on at a certain time and then it's kind of the way through. But let's think about, reducing those 1 hour meetings and thinking about the 50 minutes, the 30-minute meetings to 25 and taking breaks. So there is a kind of, it kind of stops that sensory overload. You know, having clear agendas for meetings. See, I kind of look at the one which is about meetings and think, well, you know what? I'd really like to see that anyway, and this is a great example of, something that is great to kind of bring into for everybody, clear agendas. So colleagues can make, do I want to attend or not? You know, is there information I can read before with questions? Contact details so people can ask for adjustments, and make sure that you don't become this kind of meeting culture. And make sure there is enough time to physically do the work. Yeah, and again, it's that having that kind of meeting free day approach. If we talk about sort of communication strategies and how that might work, um, I went to listen to hear somebody speak on neurodiversity, and they managed to hit two of my favorite things all in the same time. So they talked about communication, which I'm very fond of, but they also talked about the Spice Girls, and this is not to be glib in any way. But one of the things they talked about was, kind of tell me what you want, what you really, really want. And the idea behind this was being very clear and concise. Um, really think about the language, but also think about, the really succinctness. Is that a real word? It probably is, but the real succinctness of that, you know. Thinking about the language in terms of, does it feel vague? Does it feel inauthentic, ambiguous? Particularly with emails. Emails is the thing that often gets misinterpreted, and the tone. you know, think about, backing up your actions in an email so it's really clear. And again, yeah, I'm going to say clear quite a lot actually when I'm talking about this side. Clear deadlines and milestones for projects. So, everyone's got a chance to plan out their work. And just think about, if you're the kind of person who works flexibly, doesn't do much planning and kind of I want to say wings it a little bit, but I'm sure that's really what I mean to say, but it kind of adapts and changes plans quite easily. Just think about, how is that going to impact on the team? this morning, actually, I've just been talking about one-to-ones. And one of the things, thinking about one-to-ones is, asking for feedback as the manager. And I think there's a really important question, because if you are going to build trust in that relationship, what is it as the manager I can do more of or less of? That really helps build that relationship. So that's really that stop, start, continue piece. And then I wanted to kind of talk about this conversation. I think there are lots of conversations that are deemed to be tricky, um, or difficult. And I think it's often deemed tricky or difficult because we don't always know how to start that conversation. So just some things really to think about if a colleague tells you they are neurodivergent. So I'm going to start with things not to say. So, the first thing is don't start panicking, or move on quickly and ignore it. I really want you to think about that it's probably taken a lot of courage for someone to come forward and say. So, take the time to kind of have this conversation. I said earlier when we were talking about those slides that I've had all those kind of characteristics on them, that it's really important that we don't make assumptions about them. Yeah. Or immediately start treating them differently. An expression I seem to come across a lot is, we're all a little bit autistic, we're all a little bit ADHD. Kind of think about what the impact of that might be. Similarly with, I'm sorry, that must be so hard for you. I think one of the things we've done throughout this session is kind of talks about the strengths and the things that somebody who's neurodiverse brings to the party. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, Helen, but actually, how do I have this conversation? So some suggestions. And my first suggestion before I show you what's on the rest of the slide is really think about retaining. Lauren, I've given a copy of the slides to Joe, so hopefully Joe will be able to share them. You see what I've done there, Lauren? Thank you. I've just delegated that to Joe brilliantly. Yeah, that's my delegation in action. Thank you, Joe. Um, so I think this one, you know, is be your authentic self. That is really important, because if you start saying things that you wouldn't normally say, it sounds like you've just been on a course or you've attended some kind of session. So really think about using the language, that really works with you. So you really start off with thank you for sharing that with me. Ask what does it mean for them? You know, that is so important. Again, we talked about a list of characteristics, but let's really think about what does it mean for you? Ask how it impacts at work and talk about the positives as well as the negatives. I think so often I hear these conversations and people reach automatically for the negatives. So let's talk about what's, the positive stuff as well. Tell them what's available in your organization. And if you don't know, go and find out. And I think it's okay to say, I don't know. In the resources, um, I've provided you with lots of links. You can go and have a look. The great thing about this topic is there is a lot of talk about it at the moment. So there is a lot of research. There is a lot of literature that you can go and read. And I've definitely tried to signpost you to as much of that as I can. Work together to make a plan to help them thrive at work. And I use the word thrive really deliberately in this sentence. Um, I think sometimes what happens is somebody's neurodiverse, and actually let's take that wider, but people generally are surviving at work. Okay, that's a pretty tough gig. If people are surviving at work, they're getting by. And if they're getting by, they're probably not doing the best job they can do. So let's do something different and let's help people thrive at work. Let's help people be the best they can be. What will help people do that? And as we've talked about, offer to find out what support is available if you don't know. Yeah. And it's okay to say you don't know and, have that conversation about what can you tell me? Do you know of anything that I might find useful? Use it as an almost an education conversation, I think, to a certain extent. So one thing that I thought was quite interesting, we've talked about some things you could do. And this new research that has just come out from the CIPD then talks about, well, what's actually happening? And I wanted to share this with you because I think that's some interesting perspective. So things that are happening, I think flexible working's come up quite a lot. in terms of these conversations, in terms of home working or working from home, whatever you like to call it. Then for people who are neurodiverse, that's it's a great strategy because it can kind of set the working space up, particularly if you're in that kind of hot desking environment. You know, clear access to reasonable adjustments. I spoke earlier about, particularly in hiring, let's think about it. It's just available. It's not kind of I have to fill in a form and then do it. Let's just make things available. Education, yeah, awareness raising. I think that's important. And I think a lot of the work we do is kind of in that space, just kind of chatting and having conversations about it or providing a forum for people to have conversations. And this occupational health support, we've got statements, employee resource groups, that work with the organisation. Signposting to external organize. I'm going to give you a load of references in a minute. You can just take those and signpost. Review your policies to make sure they're neuro inclusive. Perhaps have some external support workers. So you get right down to the bottom there, and you've got 7% don't know what their organisation is doing. Think about the things you can start doing from what we've discussed, and kind of start to put that in place. And the report just kind of finishes up talking about really 7 guiding principles, and I think a lot of these really kind of talk about inclusion generally. So that understanding where you are and committing to a long-term plan. What have we got in the moment? What haven't we got? How, what are we going to do? Because I think to take everything that I've talked about today and put it straight in an organization, that's quite a big ask. What are the things that would be really important right now? And let's do that. Think about creating that open and supportive culture where those conversations could take place. In fact, you could talk about creating a psychologically safe culture in this space. And really think about, I feel safe to be able to be who I am. Yeah. Proactively consider neurodiversity. Really think about, so if somebody is neurodiverse and they're applying for a job, what might be the challenges? And I've talked about some of those already. Yeah. Allowing individuals to be masters of their own journey, to kind of have those conversations, to kind of talk to you around that. The inflexible working, I think, comes up again and again, and I think that's a bigger conversation than just neurodiversity. Have ongoing attention to well-being. We talked about having those check-ins in terms of, what is the workspace that is going to work for you. So have those check-ins, on a regular basis, and empower people who are neurodivergent. Let them be advocates for your business. Give them that opportunity. We've talked about employee resource groups already. So they can be advocates for what you're trying to do in your business. So I've mentioned the further resources a few times. Here's some things you could go and look at. So a few things just to kind of point out. I'm very remiss of me. I didn't put Amanda Kirby's and Theo Smith's book on here, but I would definitely recommend it. It's Amanda Kirby and Theo Smith, and it's called Neurodiversity at Work. And I would absolutely recommend that to you. I'm not much for business books. I'm going to be really honest. I don't mind reading them, but I like a book that has some practical tips, and I think that's a book that definitely has those. As well, you kind of have a look at what's the thing I really really like. I'm back to the Spice Girls again. The Neurodiversity Business Toolkit. I know other girl bands are available. Neurodiversity at Work, Neuroinclusion at Work reports. Yeah, those are the two things. And now, because not only do I like the Spice Girls, but I also like a bit of Monty Python. So just before I hand back to Joe, just for something completely different, and I just wanted to mention because I was here. So at Strategi, we are just about to launch a level 7 senior leader apprenticeship, which is focused on women's leadership. And so it's a great way to spend your apprenticeship levy. It's £14,000 worth of your apprenticeship levy. So if you'd like to have a conversation with me about that, if you just scan that QR code, it'll take you to my email, or you could just make a note of my email address and give me a shout. I'm always happy to have a conversation in that space. And it's probably worth saying that this will be the first level 7, which is focused specifically on women's development. And with that, I am going to hand back to Joe. Thank you for taking part as well, actually, before I hand back to Joe. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Helen. That was really good. Lots of information there that people can take away.
Mm.
So we're going to send out some correspondence to the people that have signed up for the event this afternoon. I'll put a post on LinkedIn. So if you would like a copy of the slides and or the recording, then please put a comment against the LinkedIn post. Our next event is next Tuesday, the 5th of March at 12:30, and it's called The Real Truth About HR Today and What We Can Do About It. A link to sign up for this will be included in the email. Also, if anyone is recruiting, we've got accountancy recruit, FD recruit, and exec recruit within the group. But finally, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to Helen for your time and effort in putting the event together, and everyone for signing up. Apologies for the blunder. And yeah, thanks very much. I hope you got a lot out of it.
Can I just answer one question before people go, Joe? There was just a question about what do I think if somebody is neurodiverse but they haven't been diagnosed?
Yeah.
Yeah, just to very briefly say, I would go down the route of having the conversation is what can I do to help you thrive at work? I think that's the route because I think what we can't do is go around diagnosing people. So I think I would start with that conversation about how would I how can I help you thrive at work? Sorry, Joe, I just wanted to make sure I answered that question you'd pop in the chat. Thank you.